They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
When you think of the original Bioshock game, it's not the gameplay itself that really stands out as being the most memorable part, at least not for me. When I think of Bioshock, I think of the incredible environment of Rapture and how atmospheric it was. An underwater dystopia in ruins that's delivered to you in such an epic way at the beginning of the game. And this game was made by Irrational Games, and the concept for the game was developed by the creative lead back then, Ken Levine. The game was seen as a spiritual successor to a game that a lot of the studio had previously worked on called System Shock. Can you believe that it released way back in 2007 too? It doesn't feel like that long ago, but that was 11 years ago. Since then we've of course got the sequel, Bioshock 2, which also takes place in Rapture, 7 years after the setting of the original game, and then the most recent Bioshock Infinite, which was set in 1912 Columbia in a city suspended in the air. So in the original Bioshock you're introduced to the game with the mission Welcome to Rapture, and it's an incredible introduction. No gods or kings, only man. And you play as a character called Jack, and you start on a plane holding a mysterious package. The plane then crashes, leaving you in the water to survive. You reach the surface and swim to safety, at least relative safety, past all of the burning plane wreckage. And there's an island with a lighthouse on it that you find, and you climb up and walk through a mysterious entrance. It turns out that this is actually the bathysphere terminus that leads to the underwater city of Rapture. Of course you see no reason why you shouldn't get into the submarine. After all, what's the worst that could happen? And as with any good single player game, the introduction is so important to set the tone and the themes and messaging for the game, and Bioshock just does it perfectly.
Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington, it belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican, it belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow, it belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture.
Your trip in the submarine includes an introduction to the city of Rapture by none other than its creator and visionary, Andrew Ryan, as well as some beautiful views of the underwater city, of course. And this early part of the game sets the tone for the visual and auditory style of the game, which is set in the 1960s, so the audio and visual design is very fitting of the era. And Rapture was originally intended to be an isolated utopia, but as with all underwater utopian cities, it all goes horribly wrong. Thanks in no small part to Adam, not a person called Adam, but instead a genetic material that can be used to grant people exceptional abilities, and you learn this pretty early on in the game. In fact, the first 10 minutes show you quite a lot of what to expect going forward. When you get off the submarine, you're greeted with what's known as a splicer killing someone, and splicers are the remains of the human population of Rapture, and due to abusive use of Adam, their bodies and minds have become deformed beyond repair, and they've murdered most of the sane population of the city. Their minds just aren't there anymore. We also get our first introduction to Atlas, and he's a voiceover on a radio that guides us in the early parts of the game, helping us to survive and move through the underwater city. All is not what it seems though. Even though the game has been out for over 10 years, I won't give away the twist. And there's a big one just in case anyone is still wanting to play the remastered version of the game. But when it comes, you will be shocked. And early on in the game we get our first taste of plasmids, which are special serums that are made from processed Adam that when introduced into the human body, modify the body and mutate the host, giving them special abilities. And you need something called Eve to keep using these special abilities though. And early on you find a plasmid, and for reasons that only Jack can explain, the character Jack, not me, he goes ahead and injects himself with it and gains the Electro Bolt ability, but only after having a pretty bad reaction and falling off a railing.
Steady now. Your
this is where we get our first glimpse into one of the more unique parts of Bioshock and one of the toughest enemies you will face, the Big Daddies, as well as the Little Sisters. Now, Big Daddies are genetically enhanced humans who've had their organs and skin grafted into an enormous diving suit. Who really knows why, but it looks damn cool. Their original purpose in Rapture was to help with construction work and maintenance projects, but they later became protectors of the Little Sisters. And the Little Sisters, however, have been genetically altered to reclaim Adam from corpses lying around Rapture. They're not necessarily a threat themselves, but their protectors, also known as the Big Daddies, will protect them with force if they feel the Little Sisters are threatened. And this is where you get a big choice in Bioshock. When it comes to the Little Sisters, you can harvest them for the Adam they possess, which in itself is quite a haunting thing. Or you can choose to not harvest them, because of course you would rather sleep soundly at night than hurt a small child, even though it's just a game. But you can rescue them if you want, rather than harvesting them, and it does give you a certain smaller amount of Adam, but it's way less initially than you get for harvesting them. And the ending of the game will differ depending on how you treat the Little Sisters. The choice is yours. Bioshock gives you access to a fluid combat system whereby you can combine your weapons with your plasmid abilities like fire or electric to take out enemies. The enemies themselves are not always particularly challenging, and it has to be said that the way the game is designed, you often find yourself moving back through areas you've already been through multiple times. It's not a linear game in the sense that you're constantly moving forward through new levels. You will definitely cover old ground multiple times, but it never gets boring. The world itself is incredible. The visuals of the outside area around the city of Rapture are awesome, and the detail in the world is just as impressive. The one thing that Rapture doesn't have a lot of though is contact with NPCs. Most of your interactions with characters in the game is done through audio communication and audio tapes. The game doesn't split the action with cutscenes, but rather tries to tell the story of the game with the gameplay itself. It's very similar to old single player games like Half-Life, for instance, in that respect. Another game that focused on the core gameplay rather than cinematic cutscenes. I mentioned that at the beginning of the game you have a friendly voiceover on the radio that guides you called Atlas. At first he wants you to try and save his family that he says he's been split from. And of course, in true video game fashion, you're the only one that can help him. And the game eventually sees you taking on the creator of Rapture, Andrew Ryan, but as I mentioned earlier, all is not as it seems. At the core of the game though, you are trying to escape. You survived a plane crash but ended up in a strange place, and all you want to do is get home, wherever home is. Remembering that this game released back in 2007, you have to admit that it was ahead of its time. It's got a solid RPG system with good combat and some memorable game moments at its core. Not to mention the imagined underwater city of Rapture was beautiful. There's something special about an underwater city, I'm not sure what it is, but they did it so well here. And it also allowed the game to utilise the water physics really well in parts to make the game feel like you're actually underwater. And the atmosphere of the game in general was just really good. The tone and music just helped complete the experience. Bioshock 2 and Infinite perhaps were not as well received depending on who you speak to. I didn't mind Bioshock 2. Infinite I thought was good and I enjoyed the story and the characters, but I think that there's still a lot to offer for this franchise. Irrational Games though have since disbanded and Ken Levine isn't working on Bioshock anymore, but I think that this franchise still has some steam in its engines. Nothing was announced relating to Bioshock at this year's E3, but it wouldn't surprise me if we saw something next year. And earlier this year, it was rumoured that a new game was in the works at a top secret 2K studio. 2K Games still have the Bioshock IP, and I for one would love to see a new modern Bioshock game, and while that may stick to the well-known formula of the previous games, I'd love to see them mix it up a bit. I think single player games especially rely so much on your first impressions, and its ability to keep you entertained and interested during the first half an hour. Bioshock did that, and it kept you. It drew you into the utopia of Rapture. It wasn't perfect, it was a bit clunky at times. The core of the game you could argue wasn't all that special, but there was just something so unique about the setting that made up for everything else. Bioshock is a classic game in my opinion, and I will always remember my first time playing it through. And that's all for today guys, do let me know your thoughts on Bioshock down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this one, give it a like, if you didn't, a dislike, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.
And in the end, what was your reward? You never said, but I think I know.